During the early stages of the First World War, the British Expeditionary Forces acknowledged that the soldiers suffered sometimes of severe medical symptoms after combat. The unrecognizable disease seemed scary, and there were no cures to it. This is a story of recognizing the shell shock. Since more sensitive viewers may find the footage disturbing, we ask you, please use your discretion before watching the video. By the time of the American Civil War, the role of artillery in warfare had grown significantly. When soldiers were exposed to intense artillery fire, it created a sense of helplessness in them due to insecurity and lack of protection against artillery firepower. The symptom could occur immediately during the combat, manifesting as different reactions like panic, fear, flight, inability to obey, or loss of situational awareness. Mentions and sources tell about mental and psychological traumas that originate from war since ancient times. Still, it was only during the American Civil War the modern medicine attempted for the first time to study, learn about, and diagnose soldiers with severe after-effects related to combat experience. After the Union and the Confederacy signed peace, and while the Franco-Prussian War ended, no major warfare occurred in the globe. The development of medicine in recognizing of war and combat-related traumas stopped for a while. It should be mentioned, however, that at the same time the increasing rail traffic and the introduction of trains naturally increased accidents as well. It was noticed that people who were involved in serious railway accidents showed symptoms similar to those who suffered combat traumas, like sleeplessness and anxiety. In Europe, a wider conflict began to simmer in the 1890s. The powder keg was finally blown up in 1914 by the Sarajevo assassination, resulting in the death of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The First World War broke out. It was an unprecedentedly large conflict, the first industry-supported and industrial war. The production facilities produced weapons, explosives, cannons, and ammunition for the armies. The United States also joined in. Millions of young men were sent to the front, led by old generals and commanders. So many did not return. Some came back devastated by the war, such as those who had experienced severe emotional trauma. A very important starting point for understanding shell shock medically is to consider the concept that others are able to face difficult situations, tolerate pressure better, and know how to think about things more broadly. At the same time, however, it is equally important to understand that everyone is afraid and that everyone's tolerance limit will break at some point. The First World War was fought with weapons that represented the pinnacle of development at that time. Their destructive power or the shock effect they caused, nor the most permanent mental damage they could generate in a human, could not be guessed. The unprecedented scale and the brutality of combat with its trench warfare, heavy artillery, and the constant threat of death led to a significant number of soldiers experiencing severe psychological traumas. The term shell shock was coined in 1915 to describe the symptoms observed in soldiers who had been exposed to a heavy bombardment or shelling. Medicine and psychiatry at the time believed that the symptoms were caused by direct exposure to artillery fire, which resulted in damage to the men's nervous system. However, the assumptions turned out to be wrong, as it was soon discovered that even soldiers who had not been exposed to the shock effect of the artillery barrage could be just as traumatized by other effects of combat. Because this post-traumatic stress was poorly understood, it made it difficult for those suffering from it to get treatment, as well as the development of proper treatment system. Perhaps the most horrific method used in combat was chemical warfare. Its use was not completely controlled because when the gas was released from the tanks, the prevailing weather conditions and wind affected where the gas would be carried. The battle gases often spread over a huge area. It didn't always move favorably, but spread with the airflow to friendly troops as well. Gas clouds could hover in certain areas for days or even weeks. In addition to the fact that exposure to gas led to physical and bodily diseases, it soon turned out that gas attacks, being exposed to them or being the target of one, were very stressful and traumatic for the soldiers. The symptoms in men were therefore similar to shell shock. It was known even then that being close to the battlefield, living in the trenches and waiting to go into battle was mentally stressful. It had a demoralizing effect on some, caused fear and tension, unnecessary restlessness, and could incite panic. That's why it was tried to change the daily routine of the soldiers when the conditions allowed, even something small that reminded of life before the war. As in this picture, the German soldiers have organized a barber shop and shave in the trench. It was rare that hygiene was taken care of, but even for a moment, the men had something to think about other than the anxiety of war that was constantly on their minds. The Royal Victoria Hospital, Netley, near Southampton in England, was a large military hospital complex built at the suggestion of Queen Victoria. Opened in 1856, circa 60 years later, the hospital became vital, at first treating and nursing the wounded British soldiers in the Great War, but soon, the place became known globally the first place, to also nurture the mentally wounded, the persons suffering of psychological war traumas. The following moving image is shot in Netley Hospital during and after the Great War, the Battle of the Somme. In the Great War from June to November 1916 was one of the heaviest that man has ever faced. Its extremity took the soldiers to the limit of endurance. During the battle, the British Army reported an unprecedentedly large number of mentally wounded in combat who were no longer able to function humanly and to whom the responsibility could no longer to be given. Private Pudmore here, he suffered of a spinal concussion after being buried by the artillery barrage in the trenches. His movement is still hysterical after being treated for 10 months. Private Meek suffers from total amnesia. He is nervous and it is accentuated as a reaction in hysterical paralysis. Meek doesn't talk either. He is mute. Also, Meek shows significant signs of general anesthesia. He doesn't react and doesn't feel anything even while the efforts to overcome the rigidity of his ankles. After being a year and a half as hospitalized and under medical treatment, Meek recovered suddenly. His memory recovered completely, and the body functions gradually. Here, Meek is teaching basket making, his peacetime job, to other patients. Private Bradshaw was paralyzed in his lower limbs in May 1916 after being buried by artillery fire. He was given a salvarsan injection, which resulted in hysterical movements of the whole body. Bradshaw recovered when he was advised and taught the correct way to move his body, arms, and legs. The treatment methods offered by medicine were limited because post-traumatic stress order was not yet very well known. The methods varied. The soldiers were tried to be rehabilitated, for example, in a group format, as you can see in this film. An exercise similar to military training is going on. At that time, from a medical point of view, shell shock included both injuries, organic due to the force of the explosion, and the resulting nervous disease, or trauma. It is estimated that 10% of all wounded and injured in the First World War had shell shock. In addition to medical, psychiatric, and hospital treatment, patients were offered other therapeutic treatment methods. It was noticed that when trauma patients were moved to, for example, a quiet farm, A more stress-free environment far from the hustle and bustle, it promoted recovery. It is now known that post-traumatic stress symptoms can be very long-lasting, or that they can start suddenly only years or even decades after the traumatic experience. However, in the 1910s and 1920s, this was not yet understood. Some of the healing methods at that time were quite extreme due to the lack of knowledge. More neutral treatment methods were, for instance, massage and hypnosis. After returning home, many traumatized soldiers were still anxious and felt ashamed. It was complicated by the fact that the community often labeled them mentally weak and cowards. Medicine and psychiatry developed when they had to study and diagnose soldiers suffering from severe war neuroses. During the interwar years, the treatment of trauma patients continued, but the methods did not change much. The correct identification of the disease was still rudimentary. In Britain, shell shock patients were treated perhaps the best in the world. The treatment methods and their consequences were carefully recorded. It was different in the US. By the time the Second World War came, the country had pretty much forgotten what it had learned at the beginning. When a new war broke out, it traumatized a vast amount, both men and women again. In addition, this new war involved countries that had not participated in the Great War. In such countries, there was no information, no experience, and no understanding of those suffering from war neurosis. And because of that, all work related to treatment methods had to be started from the very beginning. During World War II, the term combat stress reaction began to be used to describe symptoms that were previously termed shell shock. For example, during the Winter War, it was noticed that when repelling the Soviet Union's human wave-like attacks, Finnish machine gunners showed symptoms such as losing their mental balance. The problem was accentuated by the lack of sleep and the attrition of the troops, because there were very limited reserves. In Finnish medicine and military discipline, the attitude to combat trauma was very tough, and the consequences severe. Those who lost their nerve were considered cowards, and often the soldiers' symptoms were not examined, let alone given treatment. The decisions of the field court were serious, and the soldiers were severely punished. You have been listening and watching a video of Shell Shock by Premium Tales Hooking Stories. Thank you, and see you in the next one.